I don't even know if I want to make a recording on this. I feel like I'm repeating myself ad nauseum, but so this is a kind of a response to one of Sam Vaknin's videos, which is somewhat the point of the video. I can't remember if I'm getting the title of it correctly. Something like "Where have all the good men gone?" or like "The woman miss where the men have disappeared to." Uh, I, I think he still is continuing to make the same kind of unjudicious and egregious, sort of overlooking of basic salient facts that he leaves out of the narrative of his reduction of the recent history or the uh, between the genders, and I think that the conspicuous overlooking of these basic facts can even be pieced together from the the illustrations that he points to himself, where he says, people are focused on sort of on some ethnic minorities that still have traditional gender roles, um, and so a lot of people are marrying cross culture or they are dating cross culture because they can't because there isn't any kind of proper masculinity or gender role within the Western Anglosphere or something like that. Um, and these minorities that live within the borders of the West, uh, there's a reason why they still have their masculinity intact, is because it hasn't been ideologically demonized and targeted for persistent demoralization by feminists, because the identitarian intersectional sort of feminist critique cares more about race in some sense than it does about the gender issues, and in some sense you don't go after targets that are somewhere in this sort of scapegoat hierarchy, and so the masculinity of minority groups is essentially is not high on the priority list. And so in some sense I do think that this is where the men have disappeared to, or whatever, is that masculinity is masculine energy is culturally, there's a kind of cultural indoctrination as to its devaluation, as to its demoralization. It is actively devalued, it is actively denigrated, and in some sense, to the degree to which that some people still have traditional gender roles intact in these minority communities or whatever, it's because these people are given a free pass in this orthodoxy, in this feminist orthodoxy that has taken over within culture. So I think that we don't have to think that far out the box. We don't have to look at some deep pattern in history or something like that. We don't have to create esoteric narratives of causality around this. We can see it happening in real time. We can see, well, how are people uh, uh, um, treated if they exhibit masculine, the traditional masculine gender role. Like how are, and the truth is that they are hounded by a kind of pseudo intellectual cast of this kind of cultural hegemon, um, that they are field marshals, and there are mobs, and sort of Twitter mobs, and there's a psychopathic um, cudgel wielding uh, um, harassment campaign that is constantly on the look to to exercise some kind of sadistically edged, sort of scapegoating for the ideological vulnerable narcissism. And this is how it defines, its narrative of systemic oppression, which is such a vague and nebulous, sort of complaint to make, which means that you can only really know that you're gaining traction and that you're actually progressing and advancing this program if you can actually find someone to eviscerate, you can find someone to denigrate, you can find someone to actively, sort of demoralize. And white males are essentially very high on that target of this parasitic cultural project. Um, so I do think that there is something of a kind of active cultural persecution, which is not even so much targeted as in just discriminating against a group of people, but it is discriminatory against a um, it is psychologically penetrating. It is sort of gaslighting. It is sort of saying, well, you have to consider your gender identity to be part of the solution of this kind of sociological program that you have to psychologically bend the knee to, that you have to uh, uh, supplicate yourself within the prescription, the cultural prescription. And so you have to comport yourself with this mind-forged manacle, and this mind-forged manacle is simply not brought to bear on the minority groups, which Sam Vaknin notes, don't have, haven't lost their traditional gender roles. And again, we don't have to go far to diagnose what it is. It's a cultural project, um, and the I can't remember exactly the point that he sort of raised where he man, I wish I could remember. I mean, so he talks about how a lot of people in the men's rights activism, sort of movements and the MGTOWers and things like that are generally vulnerable narcissists and things like that. And I mean, I can, I can concede that point. Um, because I do think that a lot of people, when they experience this kind of psychopathic abuse or whatever, they do often generate the same kind of response as the style of the thing that sadistically traumatized them. In some sense, identitarian ideology is somewhat one way to protect yourself against it is to develop your own variant of the same program, of the same project. And I do think especially younger people, especially in this kind of saturated culture of identitarian ideology, so I mean I can concede that there are probably a lot of MGTOWers who are vulnerable narcissists because in some sense it is the kind of the zeitgeist. But in some sense I think that a lot of the MGTOWers, in some sense, they are looking for some general redress, and a lot of the MRA, sort of activism, is around the inequality that has been baked into the law itself. Sort of that vastly skew and create hazards for people. Sort of in around marriage, around children, and these sorts of things. That sort of the I mean, obviously this is different in each legal jurisdiction, but sort of the feminist ideologues, obviously, I think, did in a lot of places get their political voices heeded and listened to as they got any system of law which is essentially controlled by a sort of legislative fiat where these these systems aren't governed by general principles that have proper sort of integration, where you could just get a legislature to put in new regulations about sort of the criteria where in which one qualifies for alimony and things like that. and you can get sort of presumptions written into the regulations about, sort of how to make findings around child custody and things like that. And you've got a very sort of toxic recipe in terms of how you get a lopsided legal system that's been impregnated with a lot of biases and things like that, um, because you've created presumptions within the family courts and things like that, and you don't have enough of a substantive, principled legal structure to kick back against those prescribed criteria, which regulators can just invent and impose. Um, so I do feel a lot of sympathy for people who live in what I generally call the Napoleonic corruption, which is in some sense, um, I mean, this is quite a sophisticated concept that I try to develop, and because there are lots of levels of the Napoleonic corruption, but uh, what I think that the Napoleonic corruption in essence is that it's the centralization of the categorical imperative as formulated by um, Kantian deontology. But another way of putting it is that uh, that you become a possession of the moral authority uh, well, in a democracy, it would be, of the majority, the majority's representative government or leadership. So you kind of have this very outright, I would say, expression of the rule of man. Um, but where this particularly, I mean, usually things like that are limited by having some kind of constitutional framework within some things that are taken out of the political um, prescribable, field of legislative fiat. But I think that way, well, what I'm talking about with the Napoleonic corruption is that people lose sight of their, in some sense, capacity or duty or basic sort of membership of belonging to a society where they as an individual have to um, use the categorical imperative in their own uh, uh, calculation of moral thinking. In some sense, that all becomes moot because you're just part of the an extension of what becomes essentially a kind of a hive mind in terms of that the categorical imperative has been institutionalized, has been embedded into um, a sociological structure to which you belong, and so sort of it's done on your behalf or something like that. And I do think that I think Kant himself messed up some when he talked about, certain institutions and things like that. Because I don't know all of Kant's writings, but I think that specifically, um, I've been told that he goes on quite a lot about institutions, and I imagine that where things actually fall foul of his own formulation is that you can't have institutions systematizing the categorical imperative. There have to be forums of individuals that individually utilize the categorical imperative to perhaps facilitate persuasion and negotiation and contention over those philosophical matters. But you can't sort of get institutions that do it for individuals, because then you actually quite weirdly, uh, I think, sort of debase and also sort of hypocritically subvert, you know, the functioning of the categorical imperative. I think it becomes a sort of a self-invalidating paradox when you try to systemize it and institutionalize it for the individual, for the purpose of supposedly rendering the effect that individual uses of the categorical imperative and thinking on that question would render people. So, which is something like falling foul of just the basic fact of knowing that the smallest constituent that makes up a society is the individual. The smallest component, constituent part of it is an individual. Um, and therefore, that is the thing upon which the categorical imperative must be inculcated or installed, and that is going to involve some kind of education. And it's also going to involve some limitation of the institutional structure that a society has, so that it doesn't invalidate that level of articulation. Anyway, it's interesting because I do think that sort of the common law, the British political system, and the sort of the values laden in that actually are a wonderful example of this. Although, ironically, I think that Britain itself is culturally not in a very good place, because it has developed another variant of something like the Napoleonic corruption. And I mean, obviously, this is not a hard and fast, sort of judgment that I can make a call on, but it's just a kind of it's a loose observation that I would say that technically the British legal and political structure does not fall foul of what I would generally talk about as the Napoleonic corruption, but that culturally it has actually lost its way and has fallen into something very much like the Napoleonic corruption. And I think that this has been because of its sort of its welfare state, its sort of its nanny state, where um, people seem to expect that the centralized government should, in some sense, develop a kind of a project of human, uh, you know, the individual citizen is somewhat waiting to be accorded some project of human development, um, that is expected that society as a collective should do the work of the categorical imperative, um, and sort of overlay that or impose that, or at least invite people to that purpose, um, of that centralized conception of it. Um, And so, although it isn't in the direct political legal structure, I think that it has culturally emerged, and you have a kind of that there is this kind of paternalism expected from the collective, which is in some sense, I mean, it is probably to do with I'm not strictly against socialism. I just think that it should be practiced, if it is going to be practiced, by a private group of individuals organizing and having to devise their own structure. That, in some sense, government is the wrong type of institution to craft a socialist system. That it should not mingle with that kind of power that a state has. That you should create a private organization that has to regulate its affairs without recourse to essentially being able to bend the rules of the law itself, or dictate what the law itself is. That you have to create transparent enough structures where there are impartial levers of so you're not going to have problems with contract being trodden on, sort of people's rights in terms of their free consent and free contract, in terms of how they've administered their affairs. And sort of it. I think if you're going to practice socialism, you need to have done so in a way in which everyone has chosen and negotiated and contracted how they are going to regulate their participation in that project. I mean, I would think in general, though, if you're going to dissolve private property, it's probably too hard to keep track of consent, because then the point at which that someone does not have the ability to separate themselves from the general endeavor or collective project, you don't have a real or genuine persistence of free-flowing consent into the system. You become a kind of possession of it. But at least if you're going to do this privately, it seems to me much more conceivable. Whereas if you make this something that is being perpetrated by the state, I think the temptation is much too high to rely on unfair measures of, sort of expedient measures that run over the consent. Anyway, sorts of issues. Yeah, I don't really want to talk about socialism in particular, but it is interesting because I think that sort of the Napoleonic corruption always does create variants of that kind of sort of oversimplified, reductive, sort of spheres of operation in which expediency is utilized in a way that is not ethically coherent or even self-consistent, other than just sort of exalting its own um, domination and sort of it gets dehumanizing very quickly. People get sacrificed as the means to some greater end. Within the Napoleonic corruption, and in some sense, I think that identity politics is also is completely plugged into this kind of moral gerrymandering, which is why sort of people are standing up for identities, because then you can facilitate a level of corrupt and unaccountable tokenism, which you never have to properly the way in which policy is formulated, the way in which under the auspices of providing pride to an identity, it's such a vague and nebulous, sort of target to hit, and the measures that you're allowed to take in terms of redistributing racial pride and or redistributing material goods and extracting from scapegoats, ideological scapegoats, means that you have essentially a toolkit, a set of instruments which uh, never have to account for their own ineffectual or sort of their own secondary consequences that you can cherry pick the effects of such policies so as to ignore the counterproductive and sort of disempowering and the sort of how you're only empowering a few token elites and things like that. They're just, it's designed in some sense for a kind of feudalistic, which is, I mean, I think that these are all fundamentally characteristic of what we saw with Napoleon, which everything was done in order to destroy feudalism, and all that was created was, I would say, a new kind of revolutionary guard that became the new sort of feudal coordinating class, that just had a kind of rhetorical or semantic ideological excuse for how everything that was being done was necessary in order to supplant um, the historical systemic injustice. So I do think that calling it the Napoleonic corruption is, I mean, I think that this is the quintessential. I mean, because the Napoleonic corruption, I call it that because it is the most undifferentiated source of this kind of moral vagueness and the introduction of a kind of morally permissible language that always renders itself expedient to those who hold the mouthpiece and the centralized command structure. And the only bulwark we have against it really is proper systematized substantive principles that can actually hedge against this kind of moral vagueness, which was what the South African Constitution was meant to be fundamentally, but it has got too many judicial officers that have been politically appointed, it seems, that have a vested interest in insulating this form of identitarian, sort of ideological scapegoating and facilitating, endless corruption. It really is very sad. Anyway, I mean, I call this, sort of to group this theme together is that, these kinds of parasitic cultural projects are all based in creating ethical paradoxes, which can always be doubled down on and always sort of amplified as being a kind of hysterical moral panic that needs attention. So you can always just continue to be rushed and get a sort of a gaggle or some mob of people that don't even understand anything about the issue but are shy enough to float along with sort of the siren calls and the loud noises of hysterical compliance, believing, well, if someone is willing to be that excited about it, that there must be some kind of necessary some kind of necessity about the rushed nature of the moral emergency, and they're somewhat too shy to probe the container or the rushed container of that momentum of the project. So I mean, I do think that there is something about in this culture which is sort of imposing and projecting, or perhaps I can't find quite the right word, but this shy valence of the population should become so shy and childlike and innocent in just sort of joining the chorus of whatever is this kind of rushed pseudo intellectual zealotry that sort of gets rattled off by the field marshals, by the psychopathic, sadistically edged and I think Sam Vaknin has been similarly mesmerized by this, or I mean, in some sense, I don't really believe that he has exactly been mesmerized by it. I think that he plays the game because he's not willing to go too far to unsettle the apple cart and to sacrifice potentially his own career by making a more particularized critique um, around the matter of sort of the gender war and things like that. I mean, and I understand. Okay, well, he thinks that he perhaps should just be patted on the back well enough that he said, well, women are styling themselves after male psycho. Women are taking on the role of psychopaths. That they're role modeling themselves after that. I would again just point to, well, this isn't just an emotional strategy. It has an intellectual edifice. It has an intellectual template that it is trading off of. And until that intellectual ethical edifice is properly um, and conspicuously, is publicly, is transparently, is openly um, spoken against by people, unless people actually sort of publicly say, no, I'm drawing a line. This stuff is intellectually crazy. It's poisonous. It's psychopathic. It facilitates psychopathy. It is. It's also, I've called it proto-fascistic. I've related it here to what I call the Napoleonic corruption. I mean, that's an interesting way that I've perhaps described it. That in the Napoleonic corruption, perhaps there is the state can impose a kind of shyness on its individual citizen, on its populace, because it controls the reins of the law, of being able to invent the law and the regulation. And if you don't have a very strict, substantive, principled, legal, um, developed jurisprudence to sort of kick back at that, then you live in a society that is a runaway society. It's sort of there's, I mean, obviously a society can always commit suicide or sort of implode itself or something like that. But when they do so using semantics and using hollow rhetoric and using, incoherent, ethical paradoxes and things like that, I think that there's something particularly pernicious about that. There's something particularly, in the sense that, it's sort of like giving up civilization for tribalism, for blatant, sort of crude, vulgar, sort of wishful thinking, narrative, reality tunneling. Sort of that you can pick and choose your own reality tunnel, and you can sort of use the law to bully people that don't go along with your particular um, twisted set of sort of constructing your own expedient and useful portrayal of reality, and you never have to answer your critics. You just put them down, or you gaslight them, or you kind of leverage up the moral panic, and say, well, stop trying to distract us from what's really important. um, you just kind of turn up the volume on imposing shyness, that um, trying to make people shy about um, challenging or extracting substantiation from the narrative peddlers, um, which are also peddling a kind of very toxic and insulating, oh, no one else can understand. You can only understand it if you're from this identity. So there's a fundamental sort of dehumanization that, that other people just can't, they can't empathize. They can't even empathize, So it's this kind of ethical paradoxes all over the place. So then why are you talking about something that other people aren't even capable of empathizing with? It's sort of, it doesn't make sense. It only makes sense to continue the grift, to continue the psychopathy. Um, and while you're fighting with this, you've got basic markers or basic reality that can have its own pragmatic narrative spoken about and reasoned about, which goes completely by the wayside because it's sort of everything is, you have to have a culture war against this, which in some sense should not even be a culture war, because you should just be able to go to court and have a judge use basic substantive principles that negate and that prevent people from employing this kind of very toxic rhetoric and this very toxic contortion of reality and use of ethical paradoxes. But in the South African case, sadly, we have the courts on the side of the identitarian grifters, with this perverted version of social justice and this perverted version of affirmative action, which is, disgusting racialism, naked racialist identitarian grifting. Anyway, and sort of the tolerance of this kind of ethical vagary is why we live in a spiraling cultural sort of abyss that is becoming more and more encased in its own uh, calcified uh, and sort of stringent complacency and self-righteousness, and um, because the more it gets away with imposing shyness in its detractors, the more egregiously profane uh, it can sort of metastasize further. It can make further strange, paradoxical, and sort of disgusting claims. It just gets more and more egregious, more and more sort of like the crazy stuff that you would learn in Aryan studies in Weimar Germany. The Nazi conspiracy theories get more and more elaborate, get more and more esoteric and kooky in their claims, that force you to take on this, sort of, you have to believe in a reality that sort of comports to the narrative that the Napoleonic corruption is sort of installed within. And so you have to kind of believe that everything is just a kind of facet of social psychology, that is the only shape of the problem, and that eventually you need to sort of kill people, or you need to really damage them conspicuously in order to facilitate this redistribution of racial pride, or this redistribution of some kind of and I think that in some sense, I mean, that might seem like a bit of a stretch, but I think that is what happens when you instrumentalize the categorical imperative, and you dislodge it from enabling individuals to use it, and to use it against the state, sort of in forums like the judiciary, which, now people are part of this instrumentalization of, the guarantees of the practice of equality in the Constitution has been taken over by the legislative fiat, and you can't even use the limitations clause in the Constitution to protect yourself. It's it's a huge miscarriage of basic justice. It's a hollowing out of the Constitution, which has effectively been betrayed. I hope people won't care too much that Zuma has gone to jail. I mean, to know that the justice system is deeply broken. It has been broken by this political corruption, um, by the kind of law that is still on the books, because it when it is clearly unconstitutional. Um, the, con- the Constitutional Court and its judges have betrayed their duty to uphold the supreme law. They have mangled and destroyed the jurisprudence um, of a noble, substantive legal structure, which they have subverted by inventing completely inappropriate jurisprudence, like governmental prerogative, like the government has a prerogative to do something, and therefore they don't have to do their job in the Constitutional Court of contrasting that policy against the limitations clause. They won't even perform the limitations clause because they say, no, the governmental prerogative means that we cannot measure this policy against the limitations clause. I mean, what a disgusting paradox and abrogation of their role. And this betrayal, this murder of the Constitution, which has been perpetrated by this evil politics of identitarian chauvinism and this murky politics, is therefore facilitated by the courts in creating a mirror of the moral corruption in their own disgusting jurisprudence, in the same way that the Nazi state was completely beholden to the legislature and to the politics. You know, the law was just a mouthpiece of whichever was the, you know, it's the constitutional protection now is such a feeble window dressing. It's such a watered down lip service that we still live supposedly in some kind of, when substantively all the important protections of a democracy that is supposed to be premised in non-racialism, you know, an open liberal democracy. You can't have an open liberal democracy if you have something like a governmental prerogative, so your courts won't even use the limitations clause against their policy, because you've just completely ideologically surrendered to that disgusting racialist drive that underpins the formulation of that policy. All because essentially, under the most superficial of things, which is, well, if you want to make affirmative action policy, you actually have to target disadvantaged people, and you have to measure that policy if it's worth the discrimination of the people that can't make use of that same benefit and support, that you're making a special government program that is there to support some people. Well, you know, it should be justified in the fact that it actually functions well, that it actually has good outcomes, that it actually has good results. But instead, because they wanted to make lazy policy that said, well, no, we'll just mandate that private companies need to have these quotas, and you don't have to do any kind of means testing or actually know if the people involved as beneficiaries are disadvantaged or not. You just have to look at the color of their skin. Absolutely disgusting. But because they could just mandate these things, which then are brilliant for corrupt kleptocrats and politically connected people, because then it doesn't matter if you're disadvantaged or not, it just matters the color of your skin. And so you've got a policy that does not target disadvantaged people, does not, I would argue, probably aid almost any disadvantaged people whatsoever, especially if you account the damage that this does to the structure of the economy and the sustainability and the ability of the economy to actually grow. Because instead of having to create a program that would, let's say, offer skills and develop people that are disadvantaged, instead, the government can just mandate things and somewhat pass the buck of responsibility. So it's quite egregious on many fronts, because in some sense, it sort of, it gives the government all the power, but in some sense none of the responsibility, because the way that the policy works is that it's just a mandate. So if the country doesn't grow or doesn't do well, they can just say, well, that's because private enterprise is not following our mandates, and they're, it's very disgusting, because it's sort of, government does nothing, um, and if they fail, they can just scapegoat. It's sort of, it's a microcosm of, essentially, of the Napoleonic corruption, I would say. In a they the policy itself is sort of, is a kind of quintessential sort of expediency that has no moral coherence. Um, I mean, there are lots of ways that you could have developmental policy. That it would be much more responsible to use tax money to create subsidies that the government produces in order to promote disadvantaged people. That would make a lot more sense. Uh, so that you weren't imposing a mandate on private enterprises, but you were just um, creating a way in which the market would be supported, that you would create a bridge to help disadvantaged people to reach the market, um, and that bridge could be used to essentially level people up and transform their lives in some way, not just a kind of token uh, gesture that sort of enforces an artificial demand, which in some sense doesn't even end up in the terrible things that we have going on in terms of affirmative action, where you do literally have imposters, and you have middlemen, and you have people who are just importing things, where you're essentially forcing people to go through middlemen that makes everything more expensive, and you end up with a crazy economy in which you're effectively making the lives of the poorer people in the society much more costly, because some middleman somewhere in the chain has to sort of uh, own, be the black owner of something which is even being outsourced or subcontracted anyway. So it's complete parasitism. It's sort of, it's not sustainable. It's completely artificial. It's literally there to promote tokenism. I mean, that's what it does, and that's a general tax on the entire system. So money that's going towards tokenism could be going towards actual growth and development. But instead, we have this artificial economy, which is now, we have so much political addiction to that kind of um, resource extraction parasitism, that and it's been, and the law has made room for it as well, which is the most disgusting part of it. I mean, you could, in some sense, also you could say that the electorate itself is to blame for continually voting for this kind of opaque and corrupt politics. But because it comes in the package of chauvinism, of identitarian chauvinism, and this ideology of, this sort of white monopoly capital, and this, sort of, which is very much like the intersectional identitarian ideology, it's all this Napoleonic corrupt sort of proto-fascist, sort of conspiracy theory stuff. You've got a system which is institutionally corrupted, even though the Constitution itself does have substantive principles that should have made this impossible. So I blame the courts more than any other institution in South Africa, because the courts could have at least made it more conspicuous that the politics was would have made the corruption more Because right now, the corruption is really facilitated by the law that's on the books. In some sense, the corruption, a lot of the corruption is not detectable because it is done in order to fulfill the mandate of this affirmative action type legislation, the Promotion of Equality Act. Um, and that is a fundamental. Uh, I mean, in some sense, that you can only lay at the feet of these judges who are essentially, I mean, part of this institutionalized corruption. Um, but it is problematic because it is connected with this ideology, which, in some sense, there are a lot of people who buy into the identitarian ideology. They buy into the tribalism of their identity and the murky moral arguments around it. And it's a very sad state of affairs. Don't really know what to do about it. I mean, in a perfect world, it would be easier to underscore it, to shine a spotlight on it, if at least you had the courts able to sort of stand up to this. But that would also require that you go to the courts and you say, that they're teaching race and gender studies at UCT. This is anti-constitutional propaganda. This is racialist ideology. You don't have the academic freedom to undermine the core morality of the Constitution, but the Constitution has already given that up in terms of the affirmative action, and they they don't have a strong enough principled backbone in some sense, which is why they got institutionally corrupt in the first place. Um, so you know we're basically boiling in sort of the slowly cooked frog. We're in boiling, and we have to go in the other direction pretty quickly if we're even going to hope to, if I mean, I guess that's the question: is the frog completely cooked all the way through? And because in some sense the Constitution, I would argue, is dead. The question is, can it be resurrected? It already has been murdered. And the only way that we're going to bring it back is if we actually charge these people who have betrayed it, who have, and that's not Zuma, that's the judges themselves, and that's this political rhetoric, and that's these university um, departments and these ideologues who are guilty of constitutional damages. I mean, these are the same types of people that were in the academy at the time of Weimar Germany you know, who used their Darwinism to lend credence to the whole mythology around Aryan studies. Just now it's not based in Darwinism, now it's based in some kooky historical sociological bullshit. But it's the same project. It's just more esoteric. Now instead of inheriting genetic superiority, you inherit moral superiority by the social construct. So instead of genes, we have social constructivism. It's the same bullshit, slightly different window dressing, but it's exactly the same program. And we should have had a way to fight against it, but the courts were essentially or either infiltrated or captured, or they intellectually uh, they didn't really believe. I mean, that's what it really comes down to. And in some sense, because it's a democracy, you have to say, well, this is the real defect: is that enough of the electorates didn't really care about non-racialism. They didn't really care about the Constitution. At the end of the day, they are fine to be part of this chauvinistic identitarian ideology. That they are fine to go with the psychopaths and these racialist demagogues. I mean, that's the sad thing about it. And I do think that if you want to save the new South Africa, you might have to reconceive of its territorial borders. But it's very sad to see that even within the Cape itself, that there are, I don't know how much they are funded, maybe from the ANC itself, or they've been promoted, but with the Cape Coloured Congress and is called the Patriotic Alliance, who are now using the same racialist rhetoric as the ANC and the EFF. The same, that they say that they need to have the same kind of racialist politics, the same kind of identitarian politics, because that's sort of the new normal. And so I wonder if there is if any of this is salvageable, now that fascism has essentially become so normalized. And again, what I blame are the courts foremost, because they took the compass, they took the map, they took the boundaries, they took the fences, they took basic distinctions have been blurred because of the institutionalized corruption of the court. So I do think that that is the major defect that has led to it's sad, because I mean a lot of other places they've already made peace with the Napoleonic corruption. The American legal framework, I think, it's got some merits, it's got some charm, it's got some intuitive, sort of counterbalance. And in some sense, I mean, maybe the American system is not so bad in the grand scheme of things, because it looks like that, in some sense, the American system is almost perhaps designed to be the canary in the coal mine, because when political issues happen, they get reflected in the culture very quickly, and then the cultural dialogue can then redress the underlying political schism or something like that, or because the politics and the law is sort of hand and fist. And so maybe you can make an argument that, well, if things get bad enough, that it can reach a kind of cultural percolation that can go back and clean back up the law, but then it becomes a kind of a forever sort of pendulum swinging both ways. Obviously, in the South African case, that doesn't seem like a solution, although I would still argue that it is a solution. It just didn't work because of the institutionalized corruption of the courts. Um, but and I guess, you could say that maybe, well, the courts were mesmerized by all these university departments and this, neo-racialist agenda, and, this identitarian narrative, and they gave it credence, and they read it into the Constitution and betrayed the Constitution. And I don't know what excuses you can maybe make, that maybe the agenda was just so, but I still believe that the South African system was, on paper, resilient to the Napoleonic corruption. And that is why I say that, but in some sense, I guess you could just argue that too much of the electorates just fundamentally repudiate the Constitution. They don't believe in the Constitution. In fact, it's there for them as part of the racialist, project, that it's there to be reconceived. It's there to be reinvented, um, to facilitate the more of the Napoleonic corruption. By these psychopaths, who I believe should even be be guilty of constitutional damages for even conspiring to remove things from the Constitution. You can amend the Constitution, but to try to reduce the Constitution by trying to take things out of it, not by elaborating it, but by actually gerrymandering it. I mean, that I think is conspiracy against the highest law, against the supreme law of the land. I mean, I think that these people are effectively criminals. They should be charged with constitutional damages. There should be some kind of I mean, this is I think, in as much as that there is a value of treason, this is a kind of treason, um, to try to impoverish an open liberal democracy of its protections and of its basic values. I mean, I think it's these people are fascist scum. They they are morally bankrupt. They are vile people, uh, but they have been normalized. The It seems that the frog has been boiled, and we are on the precipice. And anyway, the fact that Zuma has been jailed for contempt of court, I think, is quite frankly besides the point. It's quite frankly not that relevant either. So I sort of changed the topic of this recording, I guess. I guess these are lots of things that I've been thinking about. They are somewhat thematically connected, I think. But